Karen Myers, present.
Mary Helen? You're muted, Mary Helen, but I see you're here. Leslie?
There.
I saw you're present.
And Kathy Kellen? I don't see her. Is that not present? How about Pen 1? Is Pen 1 present?
Thank you, Val. I don't see any of my comrades here today, but Emily, do you have have you received any emails from folks? Oh, you're on.
I saw Annalisa and I just let Claudio in.
Okay, great, super. Okay, this is James Allison calling the Pen 1 board to order. Emerald Bogue? No. Claudio Campuzano?
Present.
Annalisa Kohler?
Present.
And Jeff Noodleman? Nope, this is James Allison, I'm present. Looks like we have 3 out of 5 and a quorum. Thank you.
MCDD?
Hi, Mike Wells, president here, calling MCDD to order. Roll call, please. Corky? Corky?
Muted, but you're present.
Must be muted, but present. Nikki?
Present.
Nancy?
Present.
And I don't think I see Ken.
Oh, we're not expecting Ken today.
Okay.
Yes.
And this is Corky. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Hi,
Thank
Corky.
you. Sorry about that.
Sandy, Drainage Improvement Company?
Yeah, thanks, Val. So with Ken Anderson absent today, it will just be Tanny and I. So Tom Hansel is present. Tanny? Tanny, you present?
It's not moving.
Is his screen frozen?
It is for me. There's moving.
Oh, there he moved.
Tanny, are you present?
No audio, huh?
I have a visual of Tanny Stephenson being present. Thank you.
Is that it? Is Sandy then in order?
We can't call the order because we only have 2.
Okay. The minutes are, of course, being kept by, I guess, audio and video recording. Is that correct? Is there any public testimony? I hear none. Emily, you have no registered. Is that correct? Thank you.
Correct.
Then we'll move right on to Bill's presentation on seasonal rain and river forecast. Is Bill Owen here?
Yes.
There he is.
I am. Good morning, all. Let me try to set this up so you can see. There we go. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. So I'm here very briefly to give you an update on what meteorologists, hydrologists, and reservoir operators are expecting for forecasts this year in the Columbia River Basin. As you well know, one of our district's primary missions is emergency preparedness and response. And so part of that is making sure we understand what we're facing in the coming season. It's a little early for predictions, but they're starting to release them. And my intent here is to give you this forecast. And if it changes noticeably, I'll make sure to circle back with you in April or May to give you an idea if it's how different it might be. But right now, this is some information I was able to send to you ahead of time. Meteorologists provided this information. There are a lot of numbers on here. But the long and short of it is we're expected to have more rain in March and April than normal, which is the far right column, and closer to average in May in terms of rainfall forecasts. Temperatures are supposed to be lower generally than average in March and April, but a little bit higher in May. So what's happened to date is the precipitation forecasts have not been met, have been in March. So we'll see if we get quite a bit of, if we catch up next week or not. Right now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So we'll be below average in March. But April and May, we'll see how that plays out. So that's a big piece of information that is entered into stream flow forecast for the river. Another major part is how much snow is available on the ground currently. And this map shows the Columbia River Basin. And the green areas are basically regions where snowpack is about average. So, and areas that are blue are slightly above average, and the reverse for orange. You can see that the big mountains out in Idaho and Montana are typical snowpacks, and the areas along the Cascades and a little bit in eastern Oregon are a little bit higher in terms of snowpack. A few years ago, if some of you might remember seeing the opposite, and then in that particular year, water did get at near Vancouver and the I-5 bridge, water did get high enough where we changed our operations to start inspecting the levee system more than what we normally do on normal operations. But this year, it looks like snowpack is going to be in is a little bit heavier in Oregon and Washington. So as the spring and goes along and summertime temperatures come, that snowpack will melt a little bit earlier, and we'll see that water a little bit earlier in the river than those in Idaho and Montana. So what does all this mean? So this is a hydrograph that the Corps of Engineers and Northwest Forecast Service Center provides about stream flow forecast downstream of Bonneville Dam. The black line is their current forecasts, and the other color lines are probability forecasts that are either low or high, depending on where you are on the graph. I added a couple of lines on here to indicate how these levels of water and flow relate to our emergency action plan. You can see that the peak forecasts are getting closer to some actions we would take to inform the houseless community and our partners that are working to support the houseless communities, that they may have to start moving in low-lying areas. At this point, it doesn't look like we'll have to change our operations to begin our enhanced operations or initial operations. That happens a little bit further when the water gets a little bit higher. And you can see in here the for the Weather Service, the gauge reading at 16 feet is when they identify when flood stage occurs. We actually start doing different activities at 15 feet, so it's a little bit lower. But in either case, if the forecasts hold true, it looks like we'll be below 15 feet. So just as a reminder, these are our major activity levels. Standard operations below 15 feet. We start doing more inspections between 15 and 17.2 for those rounding to the nearest tenth of a foot. And then After that, our inspections get a little more serious after 17.2, and then we're in 24-hour operations at 21.5. The hydrograph from the previous graphic suggests, even at the top one, suggests we won't get to the full emergency activation point. It's possible we'll get to partial emergency based on the information we have now. So that's what you should expect. Just as a reference, our agency and the city of Portland do not install the Pen 1 flood wall until the river gauge gets to 23 feet. So that's in the full emergency activation piece. Right now, it doesn't look like we'll get anywhere close to that. So that's the first major flood fighting activity the public probably would see and would have an impact on it, sort of, because Marine Drive would be affected. So that was the extent of my presentation, and I am certainly open for questions. Looks like Claudio has his hand up.
Yeah, as a Pen 1 board member, I can't claim newness anymore, but can you just talk a little bit about that last item, just sort of the flood wall in Pen 1? I'm unaware of that aspect of operations, so it'd be nice to do a little learning.
Sure. So there are actually 3 places where the concrete flood wall needs to be closed in. There are openings, 3 openings in the concrete flood wall. One is right next to graphic packaging, and the walls is erected perpendicularly across Marine Drive. And so we end up closing down Marine Drive to install that flood wall. That's one location. The second location is basically adjacent to that piece, where we install 1, or I think maybe even 2 pedestrian access points. I don't think you can fit a truck through there, but there's basically 2 concrete panels we have to lift up and slide into the posts to complete the flood wall that's parallel to Marine Drive. So that's the second piece. And the third piece is around the corner. If you drive down Marine Drive and you go past the railroad bridge, you hang a left on Portland Boulevard, I believe it is. And there is an opening underneath the railroad, that berm that also needs to be installed. Concrete panels need to be installed there as well. So 3 places where concrete panels are installed, and ourselves and actually primarily PBOT are the ones who do that work. Does that answer your question?
Great. Super helpful. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Nancy and Stan, you have your hand up?
Oh, I did. I was just wondering which parts of that PBOT did, but I think you answered that question.
Yeah, so PBOT is our first choice if they're available, and their intent is to be available during that time. If water gets up that high, they start getting pretty concerned about the flood wall downtown as well. But our PBOT has been exercising each year with us at the Marine, at all three locations. So PBOT would be our first choice, and if we can't do that, then we'll have to use our own equipment. Other questions? Looks like Corky has his hand raised.
Yeah, just kind of curious, the snowpack did not mention British Columbia.
Right, so that's good observation. You can tell that the Columbia River Basin drainage area actually goes into Canada as well, and for whatever reason, the snowpack collection system that the federal government has does not report what's up in British Columbia. And you can only just project of what it must look like based on the colors below that. So it's a good point. There is snow up in British Columbia, and it does contribute to our flow at the Vancouver gauge. But I'm sorry, I just don't have the information with me right now.
Well, yeah, and I'm not surprised that USDA would not include the snowpack in Canada, but I presume that it is included in the forecast, in the river forecast.
It is, yeah.
Okay,
And
yeah.
so
I just wouldn't make sure.
yeah, it is.
And along those lines, this is a different topic, but we haven't heard anything lately about the Canada-US treaty negotiations. We don't need to talk about it right now, but that might be something to, I don't think we've had an update in the past year, so it might be worth doing sometime.
Okay, I'll work with Peggy to see if we can find, and Emily, and find a time we can provide that. Thanks for the reminder.
Thanks.
Okay.
That it, Bill?
Yes, sir. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. And I found that watching the practice installation of that floodgate quite interesting. Would you put the schedule for when you're going to do another one on, say, the MCDD calendar, so those of us who might be interested in coming and seeing that know when it's happening?
Absolutely, yeah. We'll be able to disseminate that information, whether it's through a calendar or some other manner, but make sure to get that out to you. I don't think it's been scheduled quite yet this year, but I'll work with other staff to make sure you have that information.
I would appreciate it. I did find that quite interesting.
Good, thanks. Thanks for the suggestion.
Anything else for Bill before we move on to Karine? Okay, I guess we're going to learn about our Indigenous lands that we're sitting on. Karine?
Yes, thank you, Val, and hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all. It's been a minute since I've provided updates on any of the projects I'm working on. But I am very excited to be here today with Professor David Lewis to give you an update on some research that we've been working on at the district to understand the Indigenous history in this area, as well as how we can learn from that to inform our decisions and our projects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up some slides here and we'll get into introductions for Professor in just a minute. Are people able to see my screen?
Yes.
Thumbs up. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
That's good.
Great. So what I wanted to do is I just wanted to start before we go into some of the findings from Professor Lewis, is just setting some context for everybody about the purpose of this research and the importance that it brings to the work that we do as an organization. So before doing that, I wanted to get started on thinking about where this emerged and how we ended up pursuing this research project with Professor Lewis. So this actually started back in 2018 when our staff did an all-staff outing with a member of the Grand Ronde Confederate Tribe. This was a team building exercise. We went out to Sauvie Island and did an ethnobotany walk to sort of learn about the history in that area and the relations of just levee systems with tribal communities. So on the left here, you can see in 2018, there's a photo of Mr. Archuleta just showing some of the natural resources and traditions with staff. Later, about a year, we invited Professor David Lewis to come and actually give a more comprehensive presentation to our staff about what is known around the area that we work and operate in. And then out of that came a bunch of different questions that came from staff about specific areas within the managed floodplain. You know, the Blue Lake peoples are a specific group that had lived historically in the area, but there wasn't a lot of history that we could find from quick Google searches about the people and their stories and their relationship to the land. And so a lot of the questions that surfaced at the staff meeting and presentation is what led to the development of this research project. So on page 9 of the board packet that was shared with you, there's a series of questions that includes some that came from staff and then some that were later added on as we developed scope of work with Mr. Lewis. And the big picture is really trying to understand the landscape history before the 1800s and then the 1900s, understanding the people, their cultural values, and their ways of life. We also know that there were tribal people in the city of Vanport, so understanding their relationships, you know, and the bigger context there about people actually coming in from reservations to work in the shipbuilding efforts, understanding tribal perspectives on flooding, and then also thinking of how all of this culminates into how communities live in the districts today, to better understand how to provide services in a way that matters. So the timeline for the project is we really started, you know, 2019, 2020. So we gathered a lot of information. Professor Lewis will touch on this a little bit later, but, you know, within the last year, there's been some areas that have been a bit inaccessible with COVID. So there's some libraries or some historical archives that we haven't been able to go to in person, but we hope that we can start to do that in the summer and the fall of this year. And then we started moving into an archival research and analysis phase where we really started kind of pulling apart a lot of the different information and data and maps and resources and into some of the slides that you'll see today. And we anticipate, we're just reviewing a very initial draft right now, but we anticipate having at least a summary or some executive summary report that you can read and provide input on in the summer or in the fall of this year. And all of this really culminates in several opportunities for the districts, currently as the districts are operating today, and also as we think about the evolution that the districts will be going through in the next few years with the new district. So these are all listed in the packet that was shared with you, but I just wanted to briefly touch on them, which is the first and foremost, is just developing a shared understanding of the natural landscape and of the Indigenous people who have, you know, lived here and who have currently a relationship with this area, including communities that are served through NAYA, Native American Youth and Family Center, inside of MCDD. Developing that and cultivating trust and relationships with communities. So the more that we know and we understand, the more that we open the doors and opportunities to really engage in authentic relationships with those communities. We have also had discussions about the development of a land acknowledgement that can be used in our, you know, public meetings. We have community events, and really a land acknowledgement that is made specifically for this area of service and isn't just, you know, just more generic to Portland as a whole, but really to the area that the district serves. Exploration of partnership opportunities, you know, to restore natural resources. And these are things that may be recommendations for the new district, but again, it's really that beginning point for us to begin having those discussions. There's also some things that will come out of this report incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and thinking about those and the interconnectedness with floodplain management practices. And then the development of public signage and education on the cultural history of the managed floodplain. So again, that's under ORS 550, but there's also great opportunity for us to do something related to this. Includes a recent sign that the Port of Portland did in partnership with some tribal groups on the 40-mile loop trail. So those are some of the examples in the packet that you can reference. These are really where we're headed and some of the opportunities available as we discover more of this information. So with that bit of context, I am going to hand it over to Professor Lewis to introduce himself and walk us through some of the research we found thus far. So David.
Thanks, Karen. Do you want me just to say slide every time I change it? You change it?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Great. Sorry about that. So yeah, I call this Wapato Valley Cascades area because in the past the tribes use this area and scholars call it a Wapato Valley, and it was the tribes, I think, that use the area with the Cascades, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But Basically, yeah, I am a professor at OSU. I teach in anthropology and Native Studies, and I've been teaching at various universities throughout the Willamette Valley, including PSU and Mount Hood in Portland area. And I basically just research Native peoples of Oregon and try to find these sort of obscure histories. And this was a very interesting project for me because, you know, there's been a fair amount written about the area, but nothing sort of directly in the project area that I could see. It was more based on the upriver tribal communities and maybe the Clackamas people and maybe the Multnomah people, but nothing about this area directly. So it would be very interesting to me. Go ahead and we'll start the presentation slide. So let me first introduce you to the Chinookan. So Chinookan peoples were up and down the Columbia, up to about the Wishram, Wasco area, just past the Dalles, and then all the way to the Pacific Ocean, up the coast of Washington. So most of these little shapes represent a tribal nation, people who spoke Chinook language and were all interrelated peoples. Peoples from the Dalles area knew and were related to peoples from the ocean. It was a pretty common thing to have interrelations like this. And you can see, like in the middle, there's this mishmash of various tribes. We'll look at that more closely a little bit, but that's where we are. We're at the sort of the area where the Cascades, the Clackamas, and the Multnomah kind of overlap in an overlapped area there. So it was a pretty large sort of tribal area, and the Chinookans, in a very real sense, sort of guarded their territories on the Columbia because they knew it was they saw it as a vast sort of trading region where they're going to get wealthy off mainly salmon and a few other products. And so slide. So first, a little bit of context. There was a somewhat destruction of the tribes on the Columbia that began in the 1790s, maybe 1780s, actually with smallpox, and there was a loss of, many scholars think, at least 30% of the people. And then there was another loss by malaria in around 1829, 1830, where some 90% of the people passed on. And so, and that's kind of the context that we are living in, or partially living in today, is before 1829, 1830, there wasn't a lot of records kept of the tribes. We have a few in this presentation, but but after that, there's sort of a missing area of history. You know, what happened to these people? Where did they go? We have some knowledge that they went to sort of reservations. A few went to reservations, but because we don't find any sort of permanent or many permanent settlements where people were living year round in the vicinity of the project area, there wasn't just one tribe. So we see it as a multiple tribes that sort of claim the area. And so basically all these tribes are interrelated, and that's something that maybe the literature that you guys are reading, if you're reading any, don't really talk so much about, is how interrelated everybody is. And so this was a vast trade network of interrelated tribes that had specific products that they sold or traded each other between, you know, just past the Cascades all the way to the ocean and down to the Willamette Valley. So I mean, that's can't be really emphasized enough. Go ahead and slide. So the primary culture of these peoples, the what we call the Middle Chinookans, sometimes they're part of also called the Lower Chinookans. I call them Middle Chinookans because I think the Wapato Valley, what I'm calling this area, is kind of a Middle Chinook area. It's a special area. Was basically a trade economy based on salmon and salmon products, and that's really what most of the literature is gonna going to tell you. And there was also, what I found from the research is that they utilize quite a bit of shoreline resources. They also use river fishes, lowland plains and upland plains and mountain areas. At various times of the year, they would travel into the mountains to pick berries. And so there was not only a river existence, people travel around quite a bit. We found that there's quite a bit of seasonal travel up and down the river. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. There are some permanent villages, but sometimes they're lightly settled, maybe at times when some products are not ripe or available. And then later on, when those things are ready, people will flood those villages and swell them to large sizes of population as people take advantage of these sort of ripe vegetables that are ready. And there's also the Chinooks are known for cedar products. They're known to be sort of carvers and weavers. They make bowls, canoes, clothing, hats, baskets, mainly out of cedar products from the cedar tree, western red cedar trees. I found during the research that there was quite a bit more Wapato gathering than I ever thought existed. From the research, from most of the literature, we see salmon as sort of the major product that everybody was accessing. But I saw so much Wapato use that there has to be something else going on. It's more, Wapato became more important to me as a researcher looking at this area than any other product. And then some lesser activities were sort of offshore, root digging, hunting because of sort of overwhelming salmon fish, and then Wapato resources. And then, like I said, mountain berry harvest, intertribal marriages and alliances. And then there's times a year where there's gatherings, and gatherings would happen at major trade centers like the Willamette Falls, at the Cascades Rapids, up at Solilo, or really any kind of village where there's a lot of people, as we'll see through the Lewis and Clark information. So you see on your map here, kind of a blow up map of the Cascades, Winoma, Clackamas area. Like I say, they are distinct tribes, they're interrelated, but it also suggests that some of the structures that we assume are apparent in nation states, that there are defined boundaries for nations, don't necessarily follow the same rules in tribes, that there are areas, there are overlapping use areas for gathering things like Wapato and perhaps fishing. So next slide, please. One thing to understand is all the tribes in the area used a thing we call a seasonal round, where they no tribes in the area had agriculture. So there wasn't a lot of sedentary agricultural type existence where you had to stay around your farm and sort of, till the soil, plant the crops, and just stay there. People took advantage of wild harvest, wild crops, things like we talk about Wapato, camas, were pretty major crops, huckleberries. And so when huckleberries are ripe, there's basically midsummer, things like that. And then there would be things like hunting camps and fish camps. And so when fish are running, clearly you have to have a fish camp because that's when you catch the most fish. And so in this sort of seasonal round setting, each tribe, based on the environmental resources available to them, would have their own version of a seasonal round. And so those that live on the Columbia are going to be really focused at fishing, maybe 3 or 4, perhaps 5 runs of salmon a year. And then the wintertime, we see a lot of Wapato harvesting, perhaps sturgeon harvesting. Late winter, you'll have smelt runs. So you're gonna have a smelt camp, perhaps on the Sandy River. And so that's unique for the Chinookans in this area because that's what's available to them. That would be different for like the Kalapuians in the valley who don't have the fishing falls like the Chinookans have, and rely more upon root harvesting and hunting. So that's something to be said. Next slide. So fishing culture, again, is considered primary for all the tribes in the Columbia. harvesting salmon, different runs of salmon, really kind of made the wealth and made the trade relations on the Columbia very important for hundreds of tribes, if not thousands of tribes in the vicinity of the Columbia River. And we have these 19th century drawings, woodcuts that show what the culture may have been somewhat been like. So we see on the upper right-hand side here an image of Willamette Falls in the background and a small, what appears to be plank house on the bank with a woman sort of cooking food. And there's I believe there's a canoe pulled up on the bank above her. There's a canoe in the river. And so we see this idea of native villages around Willamette Falls. On the very bottom, you see Willamette Falls and natives using various technologies to harvest, to capture and harvest fish. And at this point, this is 1841 image, so they're actually wearing some of the trade goods they've gotten from the Europeans that have come among them. So you see them wearing regular coats and things and pants. But they still have their thrust nets, their dip nets, and they're still fishing in the traditional manner as the fish are trying to get over the falls into the sort of the upper Willamette Valley. On the far right bottom or left bottom is an image from the Cowlitz area. This is a James Swan woodcut, and it shows a plank house with two canoes pulled up on shore. Not too dissimilar from the other images at all. So the Cowlitz area, even though those people were Salish speakers and they were not on the Columbia, they were above the Columbia, about at least 4 or 5 miles above the Columbia. They had a very, very similar culture. And they are known to have come into the Columbia quite a bit to trade and have relations. And then the upper left image is another image of tribes, what appears to be gillnet fishing off the bank of the Columbia River. And it says at Chinook, so that means it's way down, kind of opposite of Astoria area.
Exactly.
So there's different technologies here. So any way you can get those fish, that's good. Fish are really good after you dry them, smoke them up. They store really well, and they're really good trade products to all the inland tribes that don't have as many Chinook. So next slide. And then we have a Wapato harvest. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. It hasn't been looked at very well by anthropologists. There's some materials out there, but in this area of the Columbia, it appears between or somewhat below, maybe the Sandy River up to perhaps the Cowlitz. There is a Wapato area. That's why they call it the Wapato Valley now. Is an area that was specially, the climate or the soil or the river was perfectly situated to grow lots and lots of Wapato, more than a lot of other places on the river, which is why I found that the Cascades people came down and lived through the wintertime in this area. There's also a lot of Wapato in the Willamette Valley. There's Wapato Lake. The Tualatin Kalapuya is used quite a bit. So there's something special, something important about this area, this valley, that is not in other places in Oregon. And also with the Wapato, there's many sloughs, way different from what we have today. And this is important to say. If you're looking at changes in the river, and I think that's one of the questions, what kind of changes have happened in the Columbia River over time? The elimination of these sloughs, these slow water sloughs on the edges of the river, and the creation of new embankments and new water, management structures have changed the river so much that not as much Wapato now grows in the river. It's too fast. It flows too rapidly, and so if we were looking forward to the future in terms of like restoring the landscape, we're going to want to put back in sloughs, swamps, marshes, things like that, where Wapato and other plants can grow. And this is good for also things like juncus, cattail, and tule as well, which are also plants accessed by the tribes. They would harvest these things and make other products out of them. Juncus is good for making baskets. Cattail and tule are good for making mats, for all kinds of purposes. So, and then there's also, the freshwater mussels, frogs, freshwater fishes. So all kinds of things would have been harvested at the same time as they're getting Wapato. Next slide. Here's a Lewis and Clark map, one of our earliest records of the Columbia River. Their journals are really interesting and are a big part of the report because they saw the Columbia before there was a massive destruction of all the people. There's a lot going on here because there were a lot of people here. There's a lot of villages. Up on the far right-hand side, you see Cascade Rapids, and that's where the people came from that came down into what we call the Wapato Valley now, to the villages at Chir, Kiko, and Nichakoli. These two villages that we know that there were permanent year-round longhouses there, and that in the wintertime around, say, October, they would swell in size as the populations from the Cascades, the Cascade peoples, traveled down the river and would settle in these places for the wintertime. So these were the winter villages of the Cascades. And there's a couple reasons. One is because all the embankments were full of Wapato, and the other reason is it's really, really cold in the Columbia Gorge, so you don't want to live there through the wintertime. And right, just a few weeks ago we had the road was closed because of snow flurries and snowstorms. So that's exactly what they were experiencing too, probably much worse because it's actually warmer weather now than it was 150 years ago in the Cascades. So all these green stars you see are villages. They're all villages. And so there's a lot going on here. They're either permanent villages or temporary sort of like winter villages or summer villages where you would harvest salmon or Wapato or whatever. So you see there's a lot going on here. Next slide, please. And so, and all these other stars, and so we see the red stars are the villages again we're talking about, where the Cascades would come down from the sort of upper Columbia down to these two red stars at the bottom, where they would fill in these villages. And Lewis and Clark makes a note here on their map that there was 25 houses. If you read through the Lewis and Clark journals, and I include this as part of the report, they actually would live in these houses through the wintertime, and then roughly in April, they begin packing up the house, everything, the boards, everything, and then put them in canoes and then travel them back upriver and rebuild the houses at the Cascade Rapids in time for the salmon runs in early May. So everything was movable. There was no nails or screws or anything. They just tied them all together, these plank houses, and just took them apart and took them upriver. And so they moved them twice a year. And sort of very, very efficient sort of project. The green stars on this map are actually Wapato sites that we know about. There were places where there was Wapato on the islands. You see some of the islands that Lewis and Clark, or actually Clark drew because he was the map cartographer. There's actually noted to be lakes inside in the middle of the islands. And so these things would be like wetland lakes, which would have a swampy, marshy look. And that's where you actually would have a lot of Wapato. It's also recorded by both Lewis and Clark that people in the near Nichikiyu village had all these really small canoes pull up on shore, and they said they were about the size of one person, and so they call them Wapato canoes. And they think they were used only during like October to perhaps December to go out into the Wapato fields and gather Wapato. So they're especially made canoes just for harvesting Wapato. And so all these green stars are then Wapato sites, where there could have been Wapato sites. And there's probably more. We just don't know because we didn't have a lot of records from that time period. But and everything was so changed. But it's really startling realizing how much was here and how much has been changed. Next. As we get closer, so here's an image of those Wapato canoes that they actually drew into their journals. Really small canoes.
David,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. Just to, as we zoom in a little bit, do you mind setting a little bit of context on where this is today?
Yeah.
For people looking.
So this is Nachikoli is Blue Lake. That red star is just to the west of Blue Lake today, and we see those two blue lakes. Then there's a divide in the middle, like I think there is the same thing today. But there was a native villages there, and it was just to the records say it was just to the west of the Blue Lakes. And they utilized all the lakes for resources as well as the river itself. And then the islands off the in the Columbia here, I think one of maybe Government Island, and you see there's a really detailed. Actually, this is not their map. This is a later map, but there's a really detailed sort of lake in the middle of that island there, and all of these sort of slough areas where you see water perhaps marked on this GLO map here would be places you'd find Wapato, because they would have been slower moving rivers that were not yet channelized, that were not yet sort of under water control policies, and therefore you would have had some native vegetation in each one. So from that one village, you could see that they had access to a lot of different sites in their area from that village. All right, next slide. So Lewis and Clark also note that sturgeon was actually living at the bottom of some of these sort of shallow lakes and ponds, even on places like Wapato Island, which is we call Salvia Island today. And so sturgeon may have absolutely been a winter product, a winter fishing product of the Chinookans, and there may be some, and I haven't determined this yet, there may be some connection between the sturgeon and the Wapato themselves, especially if they're in the same environment. There may be some sort of relationship there. We haven't determined that because we haven't done the research on that, but sturgeon were an awesome fish. I've eaten sturgeon. They taste like steak to me. I love it when you smoke them. The smoked sturgeon is really good. And they're so big, you can sometimes feed a whole village for a week on one sturgeon. So clearly it would have been highly sought after in the wintertime when there was no salmon runs. And then the salmon in the middle, the fish in the middle here is the smelt. We sometimes call it Ooligan or Oolichan smelt. Smelt would run in the rivers like the Cowlitz or the Sandy on the Columbia. There's other kinds of smelt that run on the Pacific coast, and tribes up and down the west coast of the United States and Canada would harvest these smelt they call Ooligan or Oolichan in various locations as a winter food. And in fact, at some places they call it a savior fish, because roughly around January or February, and a lot of locations on the West Coast, people began running out of food. The summer stores of food would run out, and so if they didn't have a nice sort of Wapato crop in their area, they would have to sort of capture as much of these little smelts as possible, and that would help them survive into the spring. So I think we just had a smelt run. I heard we had a smelt run this year, and we've had some pretty good smelt runs the last few years in this area. And the other images are the Wapato, what the Wapato looks like when it's growing out of the water, and the Wapato bulbs, which were called Indian potato by a lot of settlers who came in the area. They actually ate quite a bit of Wapato. The early settlers ate all they could of the Wapato and liked it before they were able to grow their own potatoes, their own crops from the east. Next slide. So the tribes in around 1850s, they were much reduced in population. Americans by the 1850s had taken over much of the land. In fact, the whole of the Willamette Valley was claimed by American settlers by 1851. And so there was no space left for the tribes at all, including the tribes of the Columbia. The Columbia and the Willamette Valley were the first to be settled in Oregon. So the tribes then decided, were sort of made to decide, really kind of forced to decide to survive, to sign these treaties with the United States, to sell their land, to move to a permanent reservation where they would be safer from perhaps attacks by Americans who didn't want them on their land. And so the Cascades and the Multnomah peoples and the Clackamas people signed on to what's called the Calapooya Etc. Treaty. Sometimes it's called the Willamette Valley Treaty in 1855, which was ratified 3 months later in March of 55, actually March 3rd of 55. And so they sold their land in exchange for a permanent reservation on the coast. That became eventually the Grand Ronde Reservation. And a good number of these people did move to Grand Ronde. Some of the Cascades appeared to have remained in their territory. The ones on the North Bank likely were moved to the Yakima Reservation. Those in the Hood River area, which were also called Hood River Cascades at the time, were moved into Warm Springs, and those at Cascade Rapids or Cascade Locks now were moved partially to Grand Ronde, and maybe a few people actually did stay in their land, because there was quite a bit of assimilation of the people into into the surrounding sort of settler community, and many of the Chinookans early on learned to sort of integrate well and became mail carriers, or became steamboat workers, or sometimes steamboat captains, and they served a primary purpose in the area. Next. Sorry. So there were removals to permanent reservations, mainly in Western Oregon. As part of their promises, they were given the promises of land, money, supplies, services, and safety. But all of the best land was actually reserved for the white settlers. Natives get the least desirable lands, the lands that settlers thought were bad for agriculture. So, for example, nowadays you hear about the Warm Springs and their water problems and the Warm Springs Reservation. Well, that's because it's always been a place that had really bad land and bad water. No settlers actually wanted the Warm Springs area, the land, and so it was given to the Indians because no settlers would actually take it. So that's an example of that. So in the meantime, or between signing treaties and actually being removed, tribes were moved to temporary reservations. The big one on the Columbia was white salmon. There was a reservation there for about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. There were some temporary reservations in the area of our project. There is reports of one at the what's called the Portland Airport today, that there was a reservation of Chinookans there. And we know there were some people that were kept at the Cascades as well. There was a small reservation at Willamette Falls, but early on in that time period of about 9-10 months, people were moved to Joel Palmer's land in Dayton. So in 1856, some 4,000 people from Western Oregon moved to Grand Ronde and Celeste reservations. The first removed were the Umpquas and Calapooyans. who began removal in February 56. And then in March began the removal of the Rogue River people from Table Rock down south. Grand Ronde initially was to be a temporary reservation, but it was made permanent because they put a lot of time and money into it. I don't need to go through all these things. I think I've done all the next slide, please. So here's our first map of the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation. We don't see Chinooks listed here. We know that they came in, that there were Chinooks there, because we have some letters from Chinookan peoples. In fact, Cascades peoples. I think that when the Clackamas came in, and this is in around March, February 1856, up to maybe perhaps May of 56, that whoever was taking the census, and we have a more direct census of them later in the year, just put everybody in the title of being Clackamas Indian. So the Cascades are kind of glommed in with the Clackamas people from Oregon City, as all the same people, because there actually were interrelated. There was actually pretty good. I mean, the last two chiefs of the Clackamas at Oregon City, of the two major villages there, were the sons of a Cascades chief. So there is more going on there, more connection there, more relation there than we really know. How those sons became chiefs of those villages, we don't know. But this is the first map. We see the Calapooians got the Center Valley. We don't exactly know where the Chinookans went to, but they probably integrated with the Calapooians because they remained at Grand Ronde. Okay, next slide.
And David, if I know we're close, but we've if we could do 5 more minutes and then save
Okay.
a little time for
Sure.
Q&A.
So I wanted to mention, as you know, as part of our study, we kind of look at the changes to the land, and I see that just like the Calapooians and the changes to the Willamette Valley, there's been changes to the Columbia, that by taking away tribal culture and tribal ways of managing their land, stewarding their own land, that's a change in itself to the land itself. It creates changes in the way things are managed. If products are not being sort of harvested or used, or fish are being caught in different ways, that changes things. And then when the Americans came and began settling in large numbers, that is another change to the environment too. So what we see then is a double effect. There's a double anthropogenic change based on taking away one human factor and adding another human factor, human cultural factor in the land. Next slide. So while on the reservation for the first 20 years, even though, like we mentioned, there was a bunch of promises in terms of what we get for removal, a lot of that stuff didn't happen. It wasn't until 1872 we started to see people actually getting land. So for nearly 20 years, because it wasn't really settled until the 1880s, people didn't really have any land or any kind of resources, any money, or they lived very poor. They didn't have a lot of health resources. They were not given food. So people were starving, had poor health, and were living very poor existence. And so nothing really helped the tribes until after the 1880s, when they began to get their own land and began managing their own affairs. And that really helped them out. Next. So part of the project we look at is this idea of assimilation. There were a number of tribal people that did stay in the area. They became workers, laborers to a lot of the white people that owned land, that took farms in the area. They basically then assimilated to an American lifestyle and became part of the culture. And they've always been there. There's always been, in every town I've looked at in terms of tribal culture, there's been at least one or a couple of Indian people that have become sort of the town Indians, and they were the ones that were laborers and stuff in the area. We have a man, Klickitat man, that lived in this area at Blue Lake. They called him Chief John, and so he was Klickitat. He moved into the area and separated from the Klickitat people, and settled in the Blue Lake area and we have pictures of his cabin and stuff. And so there were folks that stayed in the area, that were tribal people in the area, that were never fully removed or escaped the reservation to move elsewhere to get jobs, because they realized that at the reservation, like I mentioned, there was no jobs, there was lots of poverty, and people were dying of disease and starvation. So they decided to stay working with the Americans and adapt to American society. The other assimilation efforts were boarding schools were imposed upon Indian people. At reservations, people were forced to basically take up farming to partially feed themselves, things like that. And this all happened under a situation where the native people were not citizens, so they had really no rights in American society until 1924 when they were given citizenship. Next. So we are in a restoration period, even though the tribes like Grand Ron's been restored more than 30 years. We are still restoring culture and identity. And so if we don't know exactly what the culture is on the Columbia today, because we haven't done the research until perhaps now, it's because we're still waiting to get around to all these projects to restore a lot of our knowledge of our history and the culture and what happened to our people over the last, 150, 180 years. So that's where we're at today. Next. And thank you for listening to me, and I guess I'm open for questions.
I have a question, one of which is, this is Peggotty, and as you were showing the various camps of tribes along the Columbia, did Lewis and Clark keep a record of the various populations of those settlements, or was that not included?
Yeah, I mean, their broad mission was to capture information about the West. I mean, you've heard about their need to find sort of an efficient way to the West, but if you look at what Jefferson asked them to do was collect a lot of information about what are the resources of the West. And so they actually have the foundation of the materials that went to the Smithsonian, because they collected all kinds of things. Plus they've collected things like population counts. So those are also, again, broad estimates, because they didn't meet all those people. They just asked the chiefs what they thought, how many people were there. And so that they got estimates from the chiefs and stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have some questions, and if some of these can be answered later or offline. A lot of people in this group know that I'm leading an effort called the Vanport Place Marking Project, and we're installing to start 4 historical signs at the former Vanport site. One of those signs is dedicated to Indigenous people. Your names come up numerous times to consult with you. There's only 2 of us, mostly volunteer, that do the work. We've consulted with and the current people. Zita Podania is probably the closest to having any knowledge of Indigenous people in the area. And so and what I've found, as you do with many topics, it's relevant about what are the best kind of shoes to wear. But, and I don't mean that lightly, because everybody has a different opinion, and research technology. And so I don't know how to incorporate that in the documentation that you did and then Karen handed out. There is no mention of the Vanport Place Marking Project, and we've done pretty extensive research. We've worked with Paul Lumley because he's on the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District. So I wondered if how much of other opinions have been into this. He's the one that worked with the Port of Portland, and Carrie Butler at the Port of Portland. We've talked with Laura John. And I'm just curious how much that was involved. And how that can coordinate with the mission, vision, values. This seems to kind of have jumped ahead of a little bit. the mission, vision, values of the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District and how we meld the two. This is the first when I got this packet, the first I'd ever heard that MCDD was doing this. So I understand now that it was because of staff, but was there any community input? Was there any other involvement of other groups in forming this? And I guess I puzzle with, because you deal, Dr. Lewis, you deal with this probably all the time, differing opinions, people say this happened, people say that happened, and we're struggling with it. So if at some point we can meet with you, that would be great. But I guess for the benefit of this group, it's even difficult because MCDD has contributed as a sponsor to the Vanport Place Marking Project, but that was not included. And I guess my last sort of question is, would your slides be available so that we could refer to them, or would it be best to meet with you and go over them and see how we can interpret that into the signage that we're developing for the Vanport site?
Yeah, you asked a lot of questions, and I hopefully I'll
I'm
get around to
sorry.
all of them.
David, I can jump in really quickly to
Sure.
just answer some of more of the technical questions. So Mary Helen, I think for the first question I heard was about participation of other groups and if there has been any community input. So I think for the development of this research, the people who developed the research questions were staff members who participated in walks with us. We have had Paul Lumley come and have a conversation with our staff. So Paul Lumley is the executive director of the Native American Youth and Family Organization, just for everybody's reference. And he has come and spoken to us about sort of NAYA's role in the community and the services that they provide. They are going to also be involved in anything, the report that Professor Lewis put together right now is really a collection of the research that's available. And it's 65 pages long. So the first step for us was really to identify how to consolidate that information to the pieces that are most relevant to the district. And then there's definitely going to be coordination with, other members of the Grand Ronde tribe, such as Greg Archuleta, which I mentioned earlier, Paul Lumley, especially with his role serving on the new district board. And then the second piece you mentioned was the awareness of this. And so I think this was included in the budget request for the 4 district boards last year. And it may not have rose to the top just because it's relatively small. We've spent less than $5,000 across the 4 districts on the research that we've done thus far. So I'm sure that might have taken some more precedent, but I appreciate the feedback so we can elevate that in the future. And then the other question I heard was an inclusion of the Vanport Place Marking Project. So at this time, we really are just focused on the research that Professor Lewis has access to through Ethnohistory Research LLC. So we did not include any other projects or any other specific organizations. In the future, I'd be happy to put that if you have specific website, Mary Helen, that outlines sort of the research that you've done or an overview of the sign that you would want to include with Indigenous history. We'd be happy to put a link in that. And then the last thing that I captured, and I may not have captured everything, it's just slides. So 2 things, this is recorded, so you'll have access to the presentation.
Okay, good.
And then
I couldn't write, I couldn't write fast enough to get some of the important stuff. And I was just speaking to partnerships, because somewhere in there it said, we're creating partnerships, and there's so much good information in there that can help. And coming from a standpoint of, it's one of those going down a rabbit hole, you put your foot in the water and then all of a sudden there's all these things to learn. And I appreciate that. And I can contact Dr. Lewis aside from this, but it's been very helpful and I appreciate it. And I recognize one last thing, the Wapato picture on your last slide. Karen, who is another, Karen Myers, who's another board member, and I live near the Blue Heron wetlands. We're in a housing project, and we have both we've funded projects to preserve the Wapato and do some school education things around that related to the native peoples. And so I think that's great that the slide and understanding how very important it was, because the state of Oregon has discovered, and this was the first place in the state of Oregon, what they call the bad Wapato. I forget the Latin name for it, but it's become an invasive species, and people are confusing it with this lavender Wapato. So that's very interesting as well. And I don't think that people know that this plant that grows in the ditches around East Columbia neighborhood is Wapato, and it's important to our history.
I don't want to confuse, maybe that last slide
Oh,
confuse you a little bit. That's actually Camas.
oh, okay. It
So
kind of, doesn't
Wapato-
it kind of look like Wapato? I mean, my
No.
memory is not that good. Okay.
No, not at all. It's different. It actually doesn't flower until April, May around here.
Okay.
So I can't emphasize enough. I was given a lot of questions
Yeah.
to answer in the research, and it's fine. But I couldn't get around to all the questions, mainly because all the libraries and archives are shut down. And so, and I'm not an expert on everything imaginable, or otherwise I'd be called Encyclopedia Dave. I really am dependent upon, archives and libraries and access to information. And so I really I'm sorry, but I had to cut the research somewhat short. There was a question in there about Vanport, about more contemporary sort of history, bringing it up to present day, perhaps, in terms of changes to the land and the native population in Portland. I really wanted to get there. I just couldn't get there because, I can't meet with people. I can't go to libraries, I can't go to archives. I mean, so I really had to deal with just what I had in my collections, which are pretty extensive, or what I could get through the OSU library, or, whatever's online. Nikki, I like your cat that runs around on your shelf. So
Yeah.
Anyway,
I love that about Zoom meeting.
Yeah, so I'm sorry I couldn't get to that question. Maybe in the future we can expand the research, and I can.
Okay.
I mean, if there really is a need to ask a lot of sort of questions and do some gathering from individuals about the native history, that'd be great. I would love to do that. That wasn't really the foundation of the project. We really wanted to get our foundation down in terms of the original native history of this place. And then Vanport comes somewhat later, kind of in the World War II era.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's actually a whole different context at the latter stages of the reservations in Oregon, and bringing a lot of people into Oregon to be sort of workers for Vanport. I actually have a lot of people at Grand Ronde and Warm Springs I'm related to, who actually met at Vanport, who were literally the Rosie the Riveter type people who actually were making ships, at the shipyards and living there, and met their spouses. And those people are, like Cheryl Kennedy at Grand Ronde is a product of that. Her mother met her father at the shipyards, and so I absolutely could do work with that. I wanted to get the foundation down first before we move into another stage, because there's a lot of research.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. And I do see Nancy has her hand up, and I also want to recognize our time. And so Nancy, just before we maybe have time for one last one, is wanted to follow with what Professor Lewis has mentioned, that this is really this is the foundation to multiple years of learning and understanding. There's a lot of information. It's really complicated, and as Mary Helen alluded, there's different perspectives, there's different tribal perspectives, there's different relationships with the land, and we recognize that, but we need to understand it so that then we can see what is most relevant and applicable to the district and the work that they do. So Nancy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to recognize the staff for starting this effort in 2018 and Professor Lewis for his research and expertise and the presentation today. I think this is so valuable. And I agree that this starts building a foundation as we have been doing with other pieces of the mission that's going to expand. I mean, it also helps build our current organization, but looking forward to the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District. So for instance, it really resonated with me when you described the fishing culture, as well as the importance of backwater channels and sloughs to the Wapato and to the culture that they had, and just understanding going from that sort of fishing, seasonal, wild harvesting culture to a farming culture, and what a shock that must have been. So I really wanted to thank you for the work that you've done and the presentation that you've given us today.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Val, I have one very final piece. I apologize, I know we're over time. Just as wanted to set some context as a follow-up. So I will be coming back to the board at the April format with a presentation that is interconnected with what we've heard today. So MCDD, that MCDD board did adopt an equity policy in August of last year. And that was something that I can provide more insight into next month. But what I wanted to do is sort of introduce the concept for you today. We, as MCDD staff and with the direction and support of the MCDD board, started looking at different areas that are listed here. So equity practices in procurement and our capital planning and our biggest investments when we think about infrastructure, our human resources, community engagement. The research you heard about today this is a really big piece, understanding our community so we can form programs and projects that work for the people we're serving, emergency preparedness and response, and others. But in the packet, in advance of next month's meeting, you will have a copy of the MCDD policy. And our goal as an organization moving this work forward is to bring an equity policy forward for the Penn 1, Penn 2, and SCAC boards, because it's going to help our staff really streamline incorporating equity into a lot of these different areas within the existing statutes of the districts. So just a continuation of the opportunities that we've shared here today, and I'll look forward to sharing more information at your meeting next month.
And we'll look forward to hearing from you. And is that then all you have to say at this moment?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
New business is now on the agenda. Who do we have who wishes to raise new business?
I have a few. I just wanted to get you knew I was going to come forward, didn't you? You were pushing that button to close, and
I could see you moving.
Okay, and this will be brief and short. I just wanted to give you a update of the next format meeting. We're looking at one of the things that we want to do, and is to provide the boards with a little more a better overview of the projects that are shared across districts. It came up in our budgeting process last year, and we'd like to use the format next month to give a better understanding of some of those efforts, including this one that we just discussed. I also wanted to give you a general update on the executive director recruitment. I want to tell you, we ran through a set of interviews last week. We had an incredible pool of people, incredible, all strong. We were as part of the committee, it was narrowed down to 4 candidates based on their experience with leading organizations. Then that includes not just that includes staff as well as board members, et cetera. So and their experience with system infrastructure. and political skills. So we will be going through the interview process. Staff will be meeting with the top 4 on Monday and giving feedback to the interview panel in advance of their meeting with the candidates on Wednesday. So we're getting there. Just want to give you an update. And then yes, did somebody have a question? No. Just one other thing that I think is important. I just want to give you an overall because it's still in. I know we've talked in the past about working with potential regional partners for funding for the new district. And we are working right now, the Urban Flood Safety Water Quality District budget shortfall committee met this week, and it looks like we might have an ability to enter into an IGA for a $6 million line of credit over 5 years with a $1.2 million draw a year. This is very preliminary. I don't want people jumping up and down and saying it's happening. And I'm also respect the partners that have stepped forward because they need to go through their own internal process before this is a done deal. But we're feeling very good about it. And in addition, that board also adopted the new district adopted a budget amendment for $122,832 of money that was provided as a grant by the LRC. So they now have that in their budget. We anticipate that will be carried over for them. And that new board is starting to enter into their budget process, just like you all are. Theirs is I'm not going to say more complicated, but requires a lot more steps because we need to include the tax conservation and I want to say this right because if I don't, I'll get tax supervising and conservation commission, the TSCC, as they approve the public budgets in Multnomah County. So this just adds another step to our overall process, but we are initiating that. And so things are looking good.
I just have one quick thing. Thank you all for letting me go on too long, and I apologize, but Nancy said it far more eloquently than I did. It's a really important topic that we need to be aware of. And as I've discovered, it's a very complicated past and history, and we need to be able to understand it. And I see Karen left, but she's done an incredible amount of work and very brought the information to us and the rest of the staff that participated. So thank you all for all those different pieces. And what do they say in Congress? I resign my sign or, to the next speaker or whatever. But thank you.
Thank you, Mary Helen. Any other new business? Hearing none, Val Humble declares Pen 2 in adjournment. Pen 1 there?
Thank you to staff, to everyone for showing up today. Thank you for the presentations. Pen 1 is adjourned.
MCDD?
Hi, thanks again. And MCDD is adjourned.
And Sandy was never in session. So bye all.
Thank you.
All right.